Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday, 21st of February. Lovely spring day here in Glasgow. Hope your weather's nice where you are. Before I introduce this afternoon's guests, I'll do, as usual, a run through of the most up-to-date coronavirus statistics. This is the status up to 2 o'clock on Saturday, the 20th of February. Another 803 confirmed cases of COVID-19, 29 newly reported deaths, people who've tested positive. There were 1,154 people in hospital last night, 102 of whom were in intensive care. 1,412,643 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination. That's over 30% of the adult population, and 33,473 have received their second dose. Since the start of the pandemic almost a year ago, a total of 1,651,216 people have been tested in Scotland. Of these, 1,454,574 tests have been negative, leaving 196,642 tests positive. Very sadly, we're approaching a new milestone on the number of people who have died. We are now at 6,945. Joining me not in the studio today, but from their own homes, are Councillor Karen Adam, Parliamentary Prospective Candidate for Bamshire and the Buckie Coast, lovely part of the country, and Siobhan Tolland, fellow Dundonian lass, Chair of Dundee Together and SNP activist and writer. Welcome to you both. Are you having nice weather where you are today, girls?
Yes, beautiful. Yep. Beautiful and sunny.
And did you have a lot of snow when the snow was here?
Yeah, it was a bit like a tundra here.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, well maybe with spring on the horizon and COVID beginning to get under control again, although slowly it feels maybe brighter days are coming. One of the things that's been announced is that care home visits in Scotland are going to start in the next week, I think. Do you think that's going to make a massive difference, Siobhan, to people who have loved ones in care homes?
I think so. I mean, I kind of thinking about some of my friends who've got, parents and stuff in care homes. I'm pretty sure that they'll be a wee bit tearful in relief, that they're going to get in to see their family. It's been a very, very difficult situation, I think, in care homes, isn't it? Quite significant isolation. I know from the experience of my friend's family that they were deeply distressed, actually, seeing the decline of their mum when the kind of first lockdown happened and the psychological impact that had. It's one of those choices I think we had to make. And, one thing that we've learned from COVID is that, if we're in doubt, take an extra cautious approach. So it was probably the right thing to do, to shut down the homes and so forth because the infection rate was so high. But it's nice that we've got to a point where it's safer now and it can allow that. It's a testimony, I think, to how well we've done with the vaccination programme and with the policy of kind of trying to build a kind of zero COVID strategy. It's good news. It's good news, and I think it will have a massive positive impact.
Yeah.
I think these stories might need to be told, though, in a post-COVID recovery, because there's a lot of trauma there.
I think that's true, and there's a lot of trauma everywhere. I think we're going to be in for something of a shock. Karen, there's lots of speculation on social media, in the press, about what the next stages of coming out of lockdown will be. What would you like to see be the next thing that happens?
Well, I think at the moment, it's really positive to see that almost 100% of people in care homes have had the vaccination. And I think within the next week or so, they'll be on to the second round, which is really encouraging. And I think our elderly population have been hit really hard with this. Isolation and loneliness was always an issue before the pandemic. And I think, that's just been an exponential rise, in the issues with that. So I think seeing this is a really good news story. And I think that, getting the children back to school next week, of course, as well. We've got the young, the early learners and up to P3s, and I think cautiously, coming out of lockdown, doing these things, recognizing that the older and the younger generations have really been hit hard with this. No play dates, no socializing for younger ones. So I think coming out of this, I'm really happy to see that there's been an emphasis on those demographics. Really, wasn't that a lovely news story as well that we saw the other day, that young boy Owen going to visit care home and waving through the window and making a snowman and things for the residents. I think it just shows how important it's going to be, coming out of lockdown for those in those situations.
Yeah, and hopefully it won't be that long before we might be able to have a coffee inside a coffee shop and not standing on the pavement at the door to order it. That would be something I'd be very grateful for. I don't mind if the pubs don't ever reopen, but I'd quite like to have a cup of coffee indoors. There's one section of the population that has had a massive rise in cases just this week that nobody really talks about, and that's the prison population. So quite alarmingly, I think Kilmarnock Prison is the main one where cases have doubled in a week, and obviously that just adds to the national figures. The other main concern in prisons is that because of the delay in the court system, we have now the largest number of people on remand than we've ever had. It's over 25% of the prison population are people on remand. Now, people on remand, to remind viewers, are people who've not yet been tried. There's been no conviction, and therefore they are innocent until proven guilty. And remand prisoners, because of the pandemic, are kept in their cells 23 out of 24 hours a day. Siobhan, do you think we could be doing something different with remand prisoners? Is there any reason to keep them in the prison estate just now?
Oh God, it's quite a cruel response, isn't it, really, when you think about it, to kind of lock someone up that's never even been tried guilty yet, in that respect. I think that if we'd maybe, the problem that we've got to a certain extent, and it's not really making an excuse, but there's a sense of we're having to react to things and there's no sense of time to think through and plan. But had we maybe had a bit more time to plan these, I think that perhaps a strategy where we didn't imprison these people on remand and allowed them to go home, it probably would have kept them safer, actually. It certainly would have helped their well-being for themselves and their families. 25%, I didn't know it was that high. That's a phenomenally high amount. I do think we need to work better with that.
I think, since the start of the pandemic. I mean, remand.
Sorry, you said. Yeah.
Remand is an issue anyway in the prison estate. A number of years ago, in the 90s, when there was a series of tragic suicides in Cornton Vale of young women, many of the young women were themselves on remand, who at that point were being held in the same cells as convicted prisoners. Now, that was obviously stopped, and that doesn't happen in the prison estate. Want to be clear about that. Remand prisoners are kept separately. But it means that they, like convicted prisoners, haven't been able to see family. They've had no visitors. They could well be on remand for a year, at least double the amount of time that they would normally be. And you'd think, Karen, with tagging and curfews, there might have been a more proportionate response, do you think?
I think, again, it's a really difficult one to go over because we are on a continuous path of learning and getting through this. And there is going to be, many mistakes and hands being thrown up and saying, perhaps we did, get this wrong, or we overlooked this particular part of our society. And I think it's incredibly important now to take a look at that and to see what can be done. And I think during the whole pandemic, it has been such a steep learning curve. And particularly when we are facing, of course, a mental health crisis. We're not facing it, we are in one. And I would hope that those kind of services would be available to those on remand, that they are being looked after and their cases being looked at. Because to think of being locked up, as you said, the issues historically with women that were on remand, I think we need to have a serious look at that and see what we can practically do at this time within the bounds of, the legal system.
Yeah, well, perhaps like a lot of things post-COVID, what we're going to see is that COVID is actually going to make us look at how we do things in a whole range of areas and see if things can be done better. And certainly people who are involved in prison reform, I think remand is an issue that people would like to see looked at, and possibly bail hostels or things being alternatives. But I just thought it was worth mentioning because it's not a group of society that we hear about. And remember, if prisoners are coming down with COVID, then they put their prison officers and their families at risk as well.
I think maybe just to interject, that, it's one of those things that when we do move forward in the post-COVID recovery, I think if we become much more integrated in the human rights approach, then perhaps we won't get into those situations, and we will develop better policies. It's something that I think certainly Scotland's moving towards much better, but I think it's constantly embedding the human rights approach in everything we do and in the institutional structures that we do. We wouldn't have perhaps got into that situation had we done that.
You're absolutely right, Siobhan, and interesting that you raised that issue of human rights, because one of the tests of human rights is whether I think people in prison are covered by Section 8 of the Human Rights Act, which is a right to private life and home. And a home doesn't mean your house; it can mean where you're living. And that was the piece of legislation that was responsible for changing the rules on slopping out. And it's one of the rights where you have to look at response and decide if it's proportionate. And it's interesting you mention human rights, because the Human Rights Act, which is reserved power in the UK, is going to be under review. The review of the Human Rights Act consultation opens next month. And I think human rights are one of these things that a great many people have a lot of misunderstanding about. And I don't think they appreciate actually just how everyone benefits from a very open and transparent attitude to human rights. So maybe that's something we'll pick up in a later programme, Siobhan. Turning to something imminent, and that is the UK budget, which is due on the 3rd of March. It's unique in as much as it is going to be held at a period where our borrowing for the fiscal year is estimated to be over 400 billion, which means that debt as a proportion of GDP will be 106%. Now, I'm not an economist, but that would make me think that suggests we're almost bankrupt. The total UK debt is a staggering 2.13 trillion, which is a figure that actually none of us can really make any sense of. But it's the highest since the 1960s. And it was high in the 1960s because we were paying for World War II. Now, I suspect we're going to be paying for the pandemic for at least a decade. So in amongst this very difficult fiscal situation, the Treasurer has an even harder job because he's being inundated with requests from every sector of the economy asking for help. Siobhan, what would you like to see Sunak do with his budget this year?
I would like to see him nationalising a couple of industries, creating a massive house building programme. I would like to see him increasing universal benefits. I would like to see him doing something like the Scottish Child Payment, that would allow ordinary people to have just a bit more money in their pockets. I would like to invest in public services. I think that we've you mentioned the kind of parallels with the post-Second World War, but if we look at what the Labour Party did in the post-Second World War recovery, it did allow a healthier, better well-being based economy that we were able to build. These things can happen. What I wouldn't want to see, of course, and I suspect we might get that, is the beginnings of an austerity 2.0 agenda. Investment in our housing, investment in our public services, and investment in our people. The thing is, I think it was Professor Reicher that was saying this the other day on Indie Sage, that, you know, you've got a kind of an economic situation where most of the spending comes from ordinary people. If you give ordinary people more money into their pockets, that's what regurgitates the economy and makes it more vibrant, for want of a better word. So it's that kind of, it's better for the economy if we invest in more people, just as much as it's better for the well-being of our people as well. So I would like them to see some of those initiatives. Whether they'll see that is maybe another issue.
Fiona, Karen, I don't imagine you disagree, but just what do you think the chances are of any of that happening?
I don't hold out much hope, to be honest. I would like to see, we do know that austerity does not work. That agenda doesn't work. Cutting public spending, hitting the poorest the hardest. It doesn't work for the economy, but it's not working for people either. You know, we're also in this mental health crisis. There needs to be more investment in within the NHS in England, certainly, and we can have some Barnett consequentials from that. Perhaps, it's a hard job for Kate Forbes, really, because she's having to, update the Scottish budget as, as she put it, dribs and drabs are coming from the UK government, so we can adjust it. I'd love to see something similar to what we've done here in Scotland, and that is certainly investing in public services. The Scottish government have targeted, health and education and businesses. And, the real onus here has been on increasing public spending, not hiking taxes for those who really cannot afford it, and taking care of our people. And, overall, we've seen without our communities how everybody really came together, buoyed each other up, even though they were probably going through, issues and troubles themselves. People really came together to help each other, and local businesses did that within our communities as well. So I'd like to see, a greater focus on how people should be rewarded for the work that they have done and for the resilience that they have shown during this time. And come on, give people a break here. We can't be taking much more of this burden on our shoulders. There needs to be some support from the government to help us get out of this. And the focus should be on recovery. It should be allowing people to have that recovery period, allowing our economy to have a recovery period. And as Siobhan touched on there, putting cash in people's pockets. They're going to remember who's been helping them throughout this time as well, investing in their local businesses, spending in our local towns. That's where the money really needs to go. And I would love to see that focus. But
Ian
I don't know if
Blackford
that's
has come out and has raised again the issue of the millions of people who've been getting no help whatsoever under the furlough scheme. So freelancers, recently self-employed people, no help whatsoever. And
that's the caveats.
Some of the freelance people are working in the arts, which have been decimated, music, theatre or whatever. But ominously, all that Sunak really has said is that public finances need to get back on a more sustainable footing. What do you think that means, Siobhan?
That's code name austerity, no?
I think it does mean austerity, yes. Yes. And he's also hinted at there'll be tax rises, but I don't imagine he means for the very wealthy. He's not going to do anything to increase corporation tax, for example, is he? So if he's going to have tax rises, where are they going to go?
Well, the thing is, he's going to be focused on this trickle-down effect, isn't he? Because that's his ideology. And that's really the worrying factor here. And as you spoke about the arts as well, they've had a double whammy with Brexit too. Our musicians are really our cultural ambassadors of our country, and their art and work has been really stifled, in performances. And this is where they really need help to get back up on their feet. They've carried us through a pandemic in some ways. Arts, culture, music has been helping people through, and we really need to be focusing money on those that need it. But that's where our our culture, where that shows how we are as where humanity lies, where we are as people, what's going to be happening there. What I would have loved to see is a UBI, universal basic income, if that had been into play at the start of this, there wouldn't have been these dropouts, these loopholes, and people, missing out on crucial funding, and fiscal help. It would have also made this transition through this crisis a lot easier and a lot smoother. People would have been held up while we could have been making these decisions.
I think universal basic income for a while was seen as a slightly odd kind of thing to the side, slightly weird idea, one of these Nordic ideas. Don't think we want it here. Actually, people are becoming a lot more interested in it, and I think there would be a massive amount of support if that was something to be taken forward.
If you look at the results of the Citizens' Assembly, then UBI is actually quite a popular choice. I think it was 58%, could be wrong. 58% of people actually would have liked to have seen some version of UBI through the Citizens' Assembly. Now, the Citizens' Assembly is a kind of cross template of the demographic of the population. So we can maybe just slightly extrapolate from that it is gaining more interest and more, more normalcy, I suppose, across people within Scotland. And I think that COVID has perhaps done that because it's shown us the need for better security.
Karen, you mentioned that we're getting information in dribs and drabs from Westminster, and that's affecting the Scottish budget. Obviously, I think I'm right in saying councils have to set their budgets by the 11th of March, so there's not much time, not much wiggle room. If something that Sunak says next week or on this, rather a week's time is going to affect the plans for the Scottish budget. So how worried are you that there's going to be a real serious implication for Scotland's finances as a result of this?
Well, I think, we've had assurances in local government from the Scottish Government. We've had, views of what funding are coming towards us. As I can only talk really for our group within Aberdeenshire Council, we have been working on a budget and setting our, opposition budget for months now, setting our priorities, seeing where we would like to see, what we would like to see within our budget and within the framework of our council. So it's something we've been working on for a while, but it is tricky because as you get information, things change and priorities might have to change. And, it's an ongoing living document, really. It's not something we can work on, that we can set and then that we can present and have sitting there just for minor tweaks when there's big major tweaks coming in, because of course it's that knock-on effect. The UK government change their position on things, and then the Scottish government obviously have to rework things, and then that comes down to local government. And we're really in the trenches here, so to speak. We're on the front line of our communities, and we really need more certainty, because that's what people want. Even if it is going to be, even yourself, when you get bad news, you would just rather know what you're dealing with to be able to work through it and think practically through it. So uncertainty is really one of those huge negative factors in this.
Yeah, not least with a general election coming up in May. You mentioned the dilemma of our musicians, and obviously because of Brexit in particular, and the inability for musicians to be able to work and travel in the EU and reciprocally. So I wanted to have a quick discussion about sort of immigration. The idea of a Scottish visa has been back on the agenda. Now, this is a suggestion that Scotland and other devolved parts of the United Kingdom might have a separate points-based system to allow migrants to come in to help in industries where we're needing people, or indeed to help in some of the more depopulated parts of Scotland. It's not a new idea. I seem to remember actually being at a conference in London with the Home Office about 2.5, 3 years ago, where a very detailed plan of the Scottish visa was presented. And I have to say, there was very little interest in discussing it, but it is back on the agenda. But there's been an interesting reaction from some people, especially in the Highlands and Islands, who said, well, that's fine, and we'd love to have more people live here, but inward migration from wherever shouldn't be at the expense of maintaining our domestic population. So it's a kind of interesting dilemma, really, isn't it, for some of the more rural parts of the country? How did you get that right? Is it more about creating jobs to keep our young people, for example, staying in the Highlands and Islands, or is it about bringing in people from either parts of the UK or abroad? So, what do you think the appropriate response should be for that? We'll start with you, Karen, seeing as you're in a rural part of the country.
I think, getting the balance there is, it's crucial. We do need migration as a country. We rely on migrants and migrant labour, particularly Banffshire and Bucking Coast. Our fishing industry, the processing sector, really relies on that. And I think, we're always in this position where we see this as a positive. It is a positive. They contribute massively to our society, to our culture, and to our communities. And I think having that internationalist view is extremely important, and not having that insular view on migration. I think in terms of certain parts of Scotland maybe being a bit worried about overpopulating particular areas. Of course, it's got to be done in a really sensitive way. I think that, of course, we also have the issue where our young people are gaining education and then shifting away from these rural communities, and we're trying to, get them to come and stay and, raise their families in the area. And I think there has to be a sensitive line to walk here, but we can't dismiss one for the other, because they both have some real positive impacts, upon our community. And I don't think that we have to view migration in any kind of narrow-minded negative manner at all.
No, I would agree, but I think it's worth making that point that replacement migration really shouldn't be an answer to population decline. There must be other ways of maintaining our communities. But there's been some recent polls, and something like 46% of young people now say that they would want to stay, particularly in the Highlands and Islands, which is up on a sort of level of about 36%, where it's been for quite some time. So that's really encouraging. But if there aren't jobs, then they're not going to stay. So what sorts of things should we be attracting to these parts of Scotland, Siobhan, to make it less likely that our young people will want to leave?
I mean, I think that, the green recovery springs to mind, doesn't it? It's that kind of element of trying to develop high-tech, high-skilled jobs that can attract and keep youngsters with something to kind of, build a future on. I think it's interesting that there is an increase in the Highlands, and that's actually really good to know. But when we're kind of youngsters kind of move away, and we've experienced this historically quite a few times, haven't we, that there's been this kind of exodus of youngsters outside Scotland, it's difficult to try and, attract people. I think that, was it Leslie did a document, and I'm thinking at the Faroe Islands and how they managed to keep youngsters, and it was investing in universities and education as well as high tech jobs and stuff as well. So we can tie that in, I think, with the green recovery and that kind of process. I know that the elements of the Scottish budget are kind of focusing on trying to build jobs for youngsters, but good public transport, good jobs, I think that these are issues that we maybe need to start thinking about if we want to sustain and keep our youngsters in Scotland, because we don't want another brain drain.
Yeah, and of course, the more that a population stabilises or increases, then the more opportunities there are for jobs, because you need services to support that. I'm interested that you haven't suggested that tourism is the answer, Siobhan. Have we got the balance wrong with tourism in Scotland? Karen, what do you think? You, again, living in a rural community, what do you think?
I think, I was just pondering that there, and, of course, jobs is a real focus there, infrastructure, transport that Siobhan touched upon. A lot of the time we find that we can't source teaching staff, and it's not you know, some of the reasons are actually because they're so far away from cities and the hubs of cities. You know, young people love to socialise and get out and about and be able to do things at the weekends, do things in the evenings, and be able to meet. Of course, you know, that's been a bit out of the question at the minute, but there needs to be that. So, as you're touching upon there within tourism, you know, when we have these, you know, infrastructure and things that people can come and visit us for, meeting places, you know, investing and regeneration within town centres would be a huge help as well, because people have to enjoy living where they are. And we can't forget, you know, that social aspect. If there's anything we've learned this year, is that people need that social aspect within their lives. And although they might have jobs with great prospects and things, which is, yes, ultimately we do need that, there also has to be a pool there. There has to be that community, and there has to be things that are pulling people in to that area. So we need to be investing in
the
these.
communities that live along the Scotland 500 route have been very critical of the massive increase in tourism that hasn't been supported by infrastructure. And because of that particular tourism destination and the way that people use it, people aren't really spending in the local communities. A lot of people are in camper vans. We know there was the horrific instances of dirty camping over the summer. When things opened up, people wanted to head to what they saw as you know, places where there were less people, therefore things were safer. And clearly, we have in some parts of the country got that balance wrong. So in the major cities like Edinburgh, for example, the ridiculous rise in Airbnb properties has been directly at the expense of affordable housing. And the government were planning to bring in a bill that was going to curb that was going to put in a whole new raft of restrictions and regulations. But it's been pulled and it's under further consideration. So, I mean, what is the right? Do we need a separate body, separate from a? We've Tourism Scotland that Visit Scotland that promotes coming to Scotland, but do we need some kind of agency that actually is looking at the impact more and making sure that local communities are taken along with it? We have a beautiful country. We want people to visit it. We want our own people to visit it. But we've got to be careful, haven't we, that it's not at the expense of local communities. Siobhan.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and I think that it moves into that renegotiation of and a holistic approach to everything that we do now in terms of how we move forward in the economy. That you know, there's not much point in having a kind of a relatively vibrant tourist industry if it's not directly positively impacting the communities that work there. My concern always with the tourist industry is it's slightly low paid, there's, you know, slightly less unionised, those kind of things. So those kind of rights maybe need to be a bit more enshrined, but it's thinking differently in terms of our economics, isn't it? It's thinking about not just how it affects our GDP and how it affects the overall kind of wealth of the nation, but how it impacts positively and interconnects with the community that it's working with. And it does need to be both. So yeah, maybe a review would be a good idea on how we could make that just a bit more balanced.
Because presumably one of the issues that's stopping people staying in rural communities is housing. There not being enough affordable housing being built and that people can't get. And yet, if you go to, say, I was on Harris last year, and I can't remember what the figure is, but they reckon it's something like 45% of the houses on Harris now are short-term holiday lets, and that's 45% of housing that's not available to young people or anyone in particular. But it's a big issue, and we're not going to solve it on today's programme. But some interesting thoughts. I want to turn very quickly to the United States. One of Biden's promises during his campaign is that the United States would re-sign the Paris Agreement, and they have done so. They've just been readmitted this week. And obviously, we have a major climate change conference in Scotland in November. If it goes ahead because of the pandemic, we don't know if it will. So, Siobhan, what do you think? What would you think the impact of America rejoining the Paris Agreement will be? Will it have a major impact, or is it a bit of window dressing? What are your hopes for when everyone meets in Scotland in November?
I mean, I think there is a massive symbolic uplift, isn't there, in Biden's government rejoining. I think John Kerry, as a spokesperson there, is particularly welcome as well. But it has to move beyond symbolism, doesn't it? I think that what we need to see is basically getting down and working now. Okay, so it's great that they've rejoined, and it's great that there's notions of humility and stuff because of what happened with Trump, but the work needs to start again because we've already lost 4 years from an American perspective. There's so much issues to resolve now, isn't there? So it would be good, I think, for America to take the lead in that sense, because they've kind of been out a wee bit, and start building on the strategies I think that we need to do. So there's that kind of, we need to kind of reduce the emissions. We need to start redressing the health imbalances that come from, the kind of the global crisis. I think it was there was a study by Harvard University and UCL saying that something like 8.6 million people died as a result of fossil fuel pollution in 2018. So there's a real health crisis here. There's a real, what I would like to genuinely see, and what in a wee bit, but I've got to my point, what I would genuinely like to see at the COP26 is this genuine notion that we have to work in a holistic way across the globe, that we have to make sure that all nations are able to meet the requirements, that the richer nations help the poorer nations in terms of meeting those goals, that we allow a strategy for poorer nations who become displaced because of climate emergencies. We allow a strategy to help and support those nations and those communities. So we have to begin to take that much more integrated approach in terms of how we're going to go. It's not just necessarily about reducing emissions, as important as that is. It's actually dealing with the impact of the crisis now and the health impact, the community impact across the globe. I was thinking about this earlier on, and thinking about, if you think about the analogy of the vaccination programme during COVID, there's not much point in Britain or America being vaccinated, and every single one of us being vaccinated, if the rest of the world, or there's still countries that don't have the vaccination. We all benefit from having everybody vaccinated, and the same principle exactly remains, I think, for global warming. We all benefit when everyone has the strategies, the systems and the support in place to kind of tackle the problems that we're going to face over the next 20, 30 years. I think never has global integration been more important now, and I think that we are seeing that shift, and I think that Biden has given us hope, in the sense that we had America, the biggest historically polluters that we've got, but there is that shift now that hopefully we can start to move and build those kind of strategies forward. But it's not an easy task, and it literally is. It's great that it's great that you're back in the Paris Accord, but let's get working now, please.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is more than just reducing emissions. I believe that in April, on Earth Day this year, Biden is planning to hold a virtual summit in which he's going to outline what America's targets are. But whether they're just targets of emission or whether they're targets for this more holistic approach, we don't know. Karen, Scotland's doing quite well, aren't we, on our emissions targets?
Yeah, I think, we've been quite well leading really in some of the things that, we've been trying to achieve, especially. Something that I just want to touch upon there, if I can carry over, is the fact that one of the major things with America rejoining and attending COP is the fact that this allows people to believe that the climate change emergency is real. Because, climate change deniers are out there, and people do look to America as this, we are one world, we're in this global world together. And America is a huge player in that. And just to have the leader of the country come out and say, yes, we are in a climate change emergency is a huge shift forward. And that hopefully will help get a lot more people on board, because we need movement collectively, you know, and all together to tackle this. But yes, I mean, we've got particularly, you know, the Green New Deal in Scotland. We're going to be, you know, focusing more on renewable energies, helping retrain and shift workers, you know, more over to our renewable energies. We've got a real focus here in Scotland on what's important at that level. And I think we have a great opportunity in November, if it goes ahead, to have a real strong voice at that table, have some influence. I think on the rest of the world would be fantastic.
Well, let's hope so. It'd be nice if our First Minister got an invite to attend, but of course,
Yes.
at the moment that's not going to happen. Maybe we should all be writing letters and emails to Biden saying he has to insist that Scotland's First Minister is there. It'd be interesting to see how the agenda goes down domestically in America. Yes, America is the world's biggest polluter. I think 24% of the world's pollution lies at America's door. China's the next biggest. But obviously the oil lobby is massively important, and it's also massively important in states which traditionally don't support the democratic cause. So we have to hope. It'd be nice to think that if this holistic, integrated approach to the world's problems on an environmental level was where America's foreign policy was going, rather than wars, for example, that might be something we could all have hope for. We'll have to wait and see. Closer to home, it's been a bad week inside the UK government on two accounts. First of all, Hancock's refusing to publish and be transparent about PPE and other procurement contracts was deemed unlawful. And this morning, and said, the leader of the opposition, Stammer, is refusing to demand that Hancock resigns. He says it's something that people wouldn't want to see. Siobhan, I can think of quite a few people that would like to see Hancock resign. I imagine you're one of them.
Yeah, I mean, but the resignation doesn't resolve the problems, because the problems are much more deeper within the Westminster government, isn't it? It's an interesting one, because in times of crisis, you know, it's a test of a person in times of crisis. It's also a test of a nation in how they react in a time of crisis. It's not a surprise that you know, Hancock worked with lack of transparency. I mean, that there's almost a revert to type there, isn't there? Because, you know, the Conservative government has actually built itself on lack of transparency from the minute it came into power. But in 10 years ago, it would have been absolutely a resignable offence. And we seem to kind of keep getting these more and more examples, don't we, of these things happen, and it's like, yeah, well, you know, whatever. It's normalised now. Corruption is normalised. Why was there lack of transparency? Well, there's, you know, we know there was lots of kind of deals with friends, etc., etc. What kind of happened? And this is the interesting thing, and I think this is where Scotland and Westminster have very much forked into very different paths now, is that England, or Westminster rather, they reverted into a kind of capitalistic free market approach to COVID. It's what's actually caused most of the problems as well, because what they did by not employing a public health approach, they've actually caused much more health issues, much more debt actually as well, because there's been investments that have not really helped in terms of public health management. The PPE being one, the test and protect, but not support those to isolate, has been a complete waste of money, according to Professor Riker, because what you've got is you've got your test, protect, but actually the support that you need in order to stop the infection spreading, which is supporting people who are isolating, that investment has not happened. So we've got this almost waste of money because it's not been looked at from a public health approach, but rather from a financial free market approach. Scotland has developed a very different approach. I think Matt Hancock's, it's just almost typifies, I think, maybe the culture that's there in Westminster is that they're unaccountable, that this is finance, it doesn't really matter. Yeah, we had other things to do, but if you compare that to what Nicola Sturgeon has done and has been ultra transparent in almost everything that the Scottish Government has done, constant transparency, it's a very, very stark contrast. And I think that people recognise that in Scotland now, that, you know, there's that element here of every time an incident like this happens, Matt Hancock, there'll be someone else in a couple of weeks or a month down the line where, you know, something else has happened. We recognise, I think, more clearly what we want from our government. Trust in the Scottish Government is significantly high. Trust in the Westminster Government has never been lower. And it's incidents like that, I think, that make Scotland reach those conclusions.
Karen, is it not a bit insulting of Stammer to suggest that people wouldn't want to see a senior cabinet minister be asked to resign at a time like this? Given that it's ordinary people who are suffering as a result of COVID, it's ordinary people whose family are dying because of COVID. Do you think that's really insulting and patronising to people?
I think what we'll have here is an extremely weak opposition. And this is why the Tory government are continually getting away with these things. You know, I mean, just reading, you know, the Scottish comedian Limmy's tweet today, he said, you know, this will just go away. He'll lay low for a couple of days. Matt Hancock will lay low and it'll just go. There's no need to resign. You know, being a bit sarcastic there. But this is what happens because they're continually not being held to account. He said he was perhaps a bit busy. He perhaps, you know, it doesn't need to be transparent because they don't want to see that he's absolutely falls short of his remit. It's a dereliction of duty. And also, Keir Starmer, it is his job to scrutinise and pick up on these things and be that strong opposition that the UK government really, really needs, or they're continuing to get away with these things because who's shouting the loudest here? You know, that's
well,
scrutiny.
You're absolutely right. Scrutiny is absolutely the job of the opposition. But as Siobhan says, it's not the first time it happened. We had the issue of I can't remember who it was. Was it somebody got a ferry contract and they didn't have any boats, or they never had a ferry contract before, when we were concerned about what was happening with Brexit. Yeah, okay, but not just Matt Hancock problems for Boris Johnson this week. Oliver Lewis, who took over from Luke Graham as the head of the union unit less than 2 weeks ago, has also left. He's bat his dummy out, thrown his toys out the pram, and he's off. He's citing irrevocable differences. There's rumours that he didn't get on with some other people who've been appointed to key positions in Number 10, one of whom is a particular friend of Boris Johnson's fiancée. So not quite sure what's going on there. But does this put the union unit, which has been tasked with keeping the union together, does this make it more of a joke than it already was? Or are we worried that whoever replaces him might be someone we have to be concerned about? What do you think, Karen?
The thing is, it doesn't matter who goes into this position. It's just doomed to fail anyway. I mean, you know, make no mistake about what this union unit is. It's just a spin machine. And all it is to try and get out rhetoric, you know, find ways that they can get their misinformation, that they can, you know, try and wave some flags and get us on side. When in reality, their union unit, they already had in place. It was their governance. That's where they should have been showing the strength of the union. They should have been showing that years ago, over a decade ago, how strong the union was for us, particularly, you know, after 2014 as well. They had their opportunity to show, not just by words, but by their deeds, and they haven't. So now they're scuppering around trying to, come up with some plans. My goodness, wouldn't you just love to be in that in that room? What have they got, whiteboards up? And I'm sure it'd be some kind of a scene from Spitting Image is what I think in my head, because nothing they come up with now is going to tackle this movement towards independence in Scotland, because we see right through it. We are no fools. We're no fools. They were
What
given
worries
chances
me
when
about
a
this
forgiven people
unit, though, is
took it.
it's not just going to be about flag waving, and it's not just going to be about love bombing Scotland. I have real concerns that what's behind it are kind of black ops. That there could be
Yeah,
some quite nasty stuff going on, and a
there
campaign
will
of
be.
misinformation and an attempt
Mhm.
to really undermine democracy in Scotland. Siobhan, do you think that's likely?
I think it's more than likely. I think we saw it during the Brexit campaign, didn't we? So, it's not like it's anything radically new in that respect. I think maybe the saving grace here, though, is that we didn't fall for it during the Brexit campaign. It seemed that the Brexit campaign from Westminster seemed very alien to us. There is some disinformation in the movement and so forth, via wings, etc., etc. But what we've got, I think, and I think Karen is absolutely right in this respect, I think we're past that point, and we've almost reached as a nation a common sense understanding of what we want now. And I'm not convinced that all that PR, black ops, whatever you want to call it, will have a massive impact. I think it has an impact on maybe people who are unsure, maybe. But I think we've almost reached that point where it will literally fall on deaf ears. I've said this since the 2019 general election. I think that Scotland has made its decision. I think we're just working out the details of that decision, and I think that we see that slow movement to what that might mean for us. I think we rejected the union in 2019 in that December there. I do. If they can't keep the union together, if an organisation that tries to keep the union together can't even keep the unit that tries to keep the union together, then we are in a kind of rather bizarre situation. But I do think that I think there'll be some dirty fights, and I think that this is not won by all by any means. But I do think that these things will ultimately not change the trajectory that we're on. I think it maybe means that we do have just a bit more of a bitter battle. My concern, honestly, at the moment is probably that kind of disinformation that's coming from within the movement, actually, rather from kind of that union unit. But that's maybe another discussion.
Well, certainly, we can't ignore the fact that the union is that the movement is not unified across everything. And you're right. I think it is something that needs looked at and discussed.
Can I pick up on that point?
Yes, surely.
It was just to say, thank goodness for the youth and the youngsters, because that's where we're seeing that growth. Over 70% of young people in favour of independence. And the reason is, our millennials, particularly our Gen Zs, they know about misinformation. Let's be a bit more confident in them. They're the generation that have grown up with and now seeing, the deep fakes. Face swapping. They are more skeptical than what, us maybe plus 40s are, because they're understanding how this all works now. They're a bit more savvy with this. And I think that's why there's also that growth within there. So thank goodness for the younger ones, because there's, this union unit, if they don't have any young folks in there, which I don't think they will, having any input, they're not going to be getting out and having any kind of relative information to the young people that are rising up in Scotland.
I think that's absolutely true. And because, you mentioned Brexit. Oliver Lewis was one of the Brexit group. He was the last remaining dominant Cummings person within Number 10. So I think you're right. I don't think that's their approach. I don't think their approach is to look at younger people. Well, talking about younger people, that's a nice segue into the last story I want to cover, and that is the quite frankly, astonishing achievement of a young Yorkshire woman called Jasmine Harrison, who at 21 years old is the youngest woman ever to row across the Atlantic in just over 3 months, I think. She capsized twice. She said when she arrived in Antigua that when she was asked what she wanted, she said food. And what surprised me is she has been raising money for a charity as she's done this amazing achievement. She's only raised £10,000. It seems a remarkably small amount. And I'm disappointed that people haven't got behind this. A fantastic achievement of this young woman and supported what she has been trying to do. So Karen, what would your message be to her?
Oh, just you are such a huge inspiration. And I was reading something, that she spoke about, was saying that she wanted to be this inspiration for young people and to say, you can get out there and change the world. And if we're going to put that in regards to politics, and coming from somebody who gets a bit, antsy sitting on a pedalo, for this is an incredible achievement, really is. And I think the fact that we didn't hear about it till afterwards, there hasn't been much publicity, maybe shows why there hasn't been that much of a influx of funds for our fundraising.
Yeah, I wonder why we haven't heard about it. Because it was it really was literally news to me. I don't know why that was the case. Siobhan, what do you make of her achievement?
But she,
I mean,
sorry, just going to sorry.
Yeah.
No,
Carry on, Karen,
sorry.
No, I was just going to say, in the terms of her saying, that you can achieve anything, you can go out and change the world. Absolutely. And, coming forward from what I was just saying about young people, not to be put off by us cynical oldies. We've had so many boundaries put in our way over the years because we're older now and seen so much red tape. That young enthusiasm, just going out and doing that is so inspirational, and particularly being a woman, I'd love to know what questions she was asked or what she was told before she went to do this, who was saying, oh no, you couldn't possibly do that, how are you going to deal with this, you're not physically able. I would love to have seen what they had to say afterwards. So a massive inspiration.
Siobhan.
What strength, what resilience, isn't it? And I think that it's one of it kind of epitomizes the qualities that we need as a nation now, and I think that she is genuinely that inspiration. I think if you connect it to politics, as Karen was saying, it struck me, remember when it was the higher and O-level, standard grade, I'm showing my age there, the higher and standard grade results and the disappointment and upset that the school kids had in Scotland, and the fact that the Scottish government changed their mind. And someone, a friend of mine, kind of said something, and it really struck me. And they said that, coming from a generation as I am in the 80s of massive political defeat, what you had here was a political victory for the youngsters. And I think that there was a kind of a strategic kind of process there. I think that the Scottish government did the right thing and gave the kind of young people hope that they can make a change, from the small things. Well, it's not that small, but small things to getting their higher results kind of revisited, to kind of crossing, the Atlantic, etc., etc. These are the people that will kind of take our future forward. And actually, these are the ones who bear the burden of our mistakes of the last few generations, the climate problems they're having to kind of resolve on our behalf, because we're the ones that made a mess of it. Thank God we have this, though. It gives me great hope that the future is actually in safe hands, because she's just one example of the amazing things that young people are doing now.
I think the thing about any kind of thing like this that she's done is the sheer sense of purpose that you must have, the inner strength that you must have to do that on your own. I mean, she said it was great to get away from everything. And you think, well, we're all getting away from everything. And actually, most of us, walking the length of herself is a big enough challenge at the moment. And it's just something I kind of would love to distill, is what makes someone take on such a physical challenge, such a dangerous challenge, and be so determined to complete it. And even if you hadn't completed it, anyone who takes on a major challenge, even if you don't complete it, it's the guts to get up and do something like that. So
And
maybe that's the message to all our politicians. Have guts.
Yes.
Guts
Yes.
changes things. Okay.
Because sometimes we will fail, but you know what? And I think it's quite a Scottish thing, even though Lassie's Yorkshire, but it's one of those things that we try. But if we fail, that's fine, but at least we've tried. That's better than not trying at all. And I do think that that's, as we move
it's
forward.
Robert the Bruce all over again, and he's Spider. Okay, well, thank you both very much for joining me today. It's been an interesting discussion over a wide range of things. As ever, we end the programme with our appeal. It takes money to run Broadcasting Scotland. We are trying to be an independent broadcaster for a modern country. We have a big year coming up with the election in May and possibly a referendum campaign. So if you've enjoyed the programme and you want us to keep being able to make them, please consider supporting us. Go to the website www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register, donate, join the crowdfunder. The money will be put to good use. Thank you very much for joining me. I'll see you next Sunday.
The Catalans, the Basques, the Galicians in the Basque.
An independent future for Scotland.
How quickly do you think a referendum can be arranged?
Best practice demands that it should be 6 months.
Just looking at the overall share numbers for Scotland at the moment, the SNP 46.4%.